Well, here I am again. Why am I wearing a hat, you may be wondering. This is really just my little attempt to illustrate how we can perhaps change our appearance in everyday terms. The classic disguise would be wearing a false nose, glasses, a beard. Well, I've already got one of those. Perhaps a wig, a hat, in order to disguise our identities. This leads on to a question that was discussed at some length on a number of occasions in the discussions that we've taken part in as part of the course, around, I suppose, identity online and through digital networks. And I suppose there are some issues there that it might be interesting to look at. Firstly, I suppose I've given the example of how one can try to portray oneself differently in real life. Of course, that can only ever be partially successful without some drastic interventions like plastic surgery or so on, or wearing a mask. How is it that we portray ourselves online, and how does this differ from the way that we portray ourselves in real life? These are quite complex questions, in that any form of mediated communication inevitably brings with it decisions as to how the individual represents his or herself, and how organisations and other bodies represent themselves. We can perhaps look at some theatrical devices there as kind of parallels to the process that's happening online. And one of the things that was explored in the early internet and was kind of celebrated as one of the properties that the internet brought as a form of communication is this notion of detaching online identity from identity in the real world, in a way that other technologies didn't quite manage to do. If one thinks of the conventions of communicating by letter, handwritten letter, or on the telephone, there's still an element of the personal there. There's a literal signature from the hand or voice which can betray our identity. One cannot entirely create a false persona, although one can attempt to do so through various tricks. And in a sense, the notion of avatars or adopted identities online became a central preoccupation of writing and theory about the internet early on. If one thinks of Sherry Turkle and what she discussed around online identity and avatars, for example. In one sense, as I've said in the discussions previously, that could be a kind of self-protection mechanism. You go into an environment where you're not sure who the other people are, one tries to protect certain information about oneself, for fear that something may happen, someone may take advantage of that information in some way. The other aspect to adopting a different persona is obviously about games and role-playing and a kind of form of theatre, pretending to be someone that we're not, for the fun of it, for the thrill of it, for the artistry of interacting with someone else and trying to figure out who they really are, or celebrating the artistry of an impression of somebody that person is not and could never be. And that can be quite liberating in terms of allowing fantastical processes to come alive in a communication which seems more live, more real than writing those fantasies down and distributing them in another way. If that was the promise of the early internet, and I suppose some of that promise has channeled itself into things like video games and so on, especially those online video games where people adopt an entire character and an entire world which is invented. So those tropes are still very much alive. But what we see, in people's personal self-representations is something quite different in a way. Social networks like Facebook and so on encourage us to be ourselves, whatever that might mean. To share intimate family photographs, to share all kinds of information about our day-to-day lives in updates and a diaristic form, rather as weblogs did before. And that's kind of enabled through the fact that social networks like Facebook, for example, are walled gardens. They offer some protection from a larger unknown interaction with people that one is not sure who they are, that might be abusive or might not be sympathetic to you, or might have opinions that you don't like and so on. This notion that one is surrounded by a group of friends or fans who support the individual in a social network. That's a very appealing notion. It's also a little bit narcissistic as well. So I think we see that it's become almost kind of de rigueur to share lots and lots of details of one's lives through these networks, and increase the notion of an attention economy. That one is very active and gains attention from one's friends, acquaintances, people, perhaps people that one barely knows but may have met once or twice. Those kinds of activities, that's relatively new. That's something slightly different that's enabled through this kind of, limited version of the internet, where people pick and choose who's able to see what they choose to share in that sense. And therefore that need for a fantastical persona goes away. But I wonder if it's entirely disappeared. And I suppose my question is, in the process of using our so-called real identities through social networks, do we not perhaps also put on a mask, also codify and make fantastical in some ways our real identities? Is that what things like Facebook do? There's still a kind of distancing, a kind of self-protection going on, but it's more about the ways in which one behaves, the kinds of attitudes and poses that one strikes in photographs, the kinds of activities that project a particular image, usually a positive, very positive image of oneself, out into the world. Is that not also a kind of form of play acting and role play?